Now sometimes we do not know in advance the number of arguments that will be passed into a function. Sometimes you may want to pass 2 arguments into a parameter, and sometimes you may want to pass 10 arguments into that same parameter. And Python allows us to handle this kind of situation through function calls with an arbitrary number of arguments, and there are 2 ways in which we can do this. We can use the concept of args, or we can use the concept of kwargs. Now args stands for arguments and refers to non-keyword arguments, and kwargs stands for keyword arguments. So we use args and kwargs as an argument when we are unsure about the number of arguments to pass into the functions. Now the best way to understand how these operate is by seeing and working through some examples. Now the syntax is very similar in terms of defining a function, but to create an arbitrary number of arguments, we can use a single asterisk before the parameter name to denote that this parameter can receive a varying number of arguments. So let's say we are creating a multiplayer game and we want to welcome all the players at the start. So we could, for example, create a function, so we'll start with def. We will then provide the function a name called game_players, and then inside the parentheses we once again define the parameters we want to include. Now the difference here is that because we don't know how many names are going to be passed into this function, we are going to put a single asterisk, so the star symbol, and then we are going to follow this with the parameter name. So we'll put names in this instance. We can then put a colon. Now inside the body of the function, I'm simply going to put for name in names, and then I'm going to print out hello followed by a space, and then concatenate the name that's passed in. Now when I call the function game_players and then pass in the names Sally, James, Anna, and Tim, you can see we print out hello Sally, hello James, hello Anna, and hello Tim to the screen. So here we've called the function with multiple non-keyword arguments, and what happens in this scenario is that these arguments get wrapped up in a tuple data structure before being passed into the function. And then inside of our function, what we are doing is iterating through this tuple in order to obtain the arguments one at a time. And we've discussed the concept of accessing elements from data structures earlier in the course. So if I now call the same method, but this time we only have 2 players, so we can pass in Ben, and we can also pass in Fiona, you can see the function still operates without any error. And in the first example, we passed in 4 non-keyword arguments, and in the second example, we passed in 2 non-keyword arguments. So we can use the star syntax before the parameter name to allow an arbitrary number of non-keyword arguments to be passed into a single parameter. Let's go through another example. Let's say I had a function called add_machine. And inside parentheses, I define 3 parameters. So let's just call these A, B, and C for the time being. I can then put a colon. If I then create a variable called total and set this equal to the sum of A plus B plus C, and then just return the variable called total, you can see that I can call add_machine and I can pass in 1, 5, and 8 into the function, and we get 14 as the result. But let's suppose we don't know how many numbers we want to pass through into the add_machine function. So if I try to call add_machine and pass in 1, 2, 4, and 8, you can see we run into a type error, and it says that the function add_machine takes 3 positional arguments, but 4 were given. So how can we address this? Well, we can use args. So we can define add_machine and this time within parentheses I'm going to put a star symbol. And then after the asterisk I'm then going to put the parameter name nums. I can then put a colon. I will then inside the body of the function create a variable called total and set this equal to 0. I can then use a for loop to iterate through the tuple that will be passed into the nums parameter, so I could put for num in nums and then put a colon. And for this example, I'm simply going to put total plus equals num and then return the variable total. When I now call add underscore machine and then pass in some numbers, so let's pass in 1, 2, 3, 8, 65 and 4, you can see we get the result 83. And if I simply pass into the add underscore machine function the numbers 2 and 3, we return 5. So we are providing the add underscore machine function with a different number of non-keyword arguments, but the function still operates as expected. Now the second way we can collect an arbitrary number of arguments in a function is by using kwargs or keyword arguments. And for this, we precede the parameter name not with 1 star, but with 2 star symbols. So we put 2 asterisks. And what this will enable us to do is essentially pass in a dictionary data structure into a specific parameter. So let's see an example. Let's say I wanted to collect some personal information in a survey. So I'm going to create a function called personal underscore info, and then inside parentheses, I'm going to place 2 stars to represent kwargs, and then I'm going to put the parameter name, and for this example, I'm going to put info. I can then put a colon. Now the first thing I'm going to do is actually print out the type of object that info relates to, and you will see shortly that this will be a dictionary object. I can then put in the function's body for key, comma, value in info.items followed by a set of parentheses, and we saw this when we discussed dictionary data structures. I can then put a colon. I can then access the respective key value pairs from the dictionary. So I could put print, and then inside parentheses I could put the key, followed by a set of curly braces, has a value, and then another set of curly braces. I will then use the format method, and inside the format method's parentheses I will pass in key, then a comma, and then value. So if we now call personal underscore info and pass some information into it, let's say we first of all pass an argument into first underscore name, and we'll set this equal to Simon. We'll then pass in a parameter called last underscore name, and we'll set this equal to Smith. We'll then pass in a parameter called age, and we'll set this equal to 35. And finally, we'll pass in a parameter called hobby, and we'll set this equal to darts. Now when I run this function, we do indeed obtain info in a dictionary data structure. And then we can see the key first underscore name has a value Simon. The key last underscore name has a value Smith, and so on. So for each keyword argument that we pass into this function, we are storing it as an item in a dictionary. The key relates to the parameter's name, and the value relates to the argument that you pass into that parameter. So I can also use this function and pass in different information. So let's say the next person we approach, we collect new information, so I'll call personal underscore info, and then inside parentheses we'll change first underscore name to be Sally. We'll then have last underscore name as Hobbs. Sally can also be 35 years old. And this time we'll collect an email, so we'll put email equals sallyhobbs@abc.com, And finally, we get Sally's favourite colour, so we'll put fav_colour and we'll set this equal to red. When I now run the function, we once again pass in a dictionary, and this time we've managed to collect a different set of data utilising the same function, with a different number of arguments passed into it. So we've just seen two ways here of being able to collect an arbitrary number of arguments, firstly using non-keyword arguments, so args, which is where we precede the parameter name with a star, and we saw kwargs, where we precede the parameter name with two asterisks, which are keyword arguments. Args are passed in as a tuple, and keyword arguments are passed in as a dictionary. So this gives us even more flexibility when creating functions. We can include args and kwargs within the same function definition if we so desire. We can also create a function that expects an arbitrary number of arguments as well as a single argument, like we saw when we discussed positional and keyword arguments. Try to practice creating your own functions and include args and kwargs accordingly. Then try to call your function and pass in a different number of arguments to see if your functions operate as expected.